I wanted to talk briefly about this amazing channel, actually two channels that I discovered over the past couple weeks. New England Wildlife and More is the first one, and the second one is Steve 1989 MRE Info. I'll link them in the description below if you want to check them out. Kind of very random from my channel, but I think I was watching both of them, going between the two as YouTube was recommending the two channels. I don't know how I got there. I think New England Wildlife and More posted a video of a can from 1934, I believe. And it was a can of creamed corn. And I was so intrigued. It has millions of views. I was like, what? I didn't even think a can could last that long from that long ago. I watched it and the corn literally still looked like corn. Like it had its yellowness. The cream corn part of it was still very creamy. It was so weird. I was like very intrigued, and so I just watched a bunch of other videos of New England Wildlife and More opening very old cans of food, packets of Jello. There's even a Hershey's hot cocoa from the 80s versus a Hershey's hot cocoa from now. And he opened a lot of stuff from the 1960s and the 1940s, and even Steve 1989 MRE Info opened a ration. He opens a lot of military rations, meals ready to eat, MREs, right? But he was opening stuff from like the 1800s. You guys, 1900s and the 1940s, like World War II rations that are still well preserved. And it got me thinking, at the time, like the cans that they had back then, and I'll see if I could get some screenshots and post them up, because I really want you to look at some of the things on these cans. The info on a lot of these cans was not that different from the info that you see on cans today. And I have with me some illustration props, like this whole kernel corn and this beans can. Like if you go to their channels, you check out their channels, you notice that a lot of the canning from back in the day really hasn't changed. The information, a lot of what changed maybe might be the wording. They might not say violently boil these days, but a lot of instructions still remain to boil. The ribbing in the cans used to be more rigid. They were even sealed. I don't know if you could see this. There's a little seal here in this can of corn. But they used to seal stuff with lead, but they changed that. But the make of cans, the way cans are opened, their shaping, their ribs and ridges, the underside, the mysterious codes on the cans, even the net weight, how you see that, like the net weight abbreviated. A lot of these things have remained the same for decades. But what's kind of most mysterious is that when a lot of these cans initially came into circulation, the mentality on race was terrible. I mean, let's talk about like the 1930s. I'm honestly thinking about like race films, and that wasn't too far off from, I believe, The Jazz Singer coming out. That can of corn, creamed corn, that was open from the 1930s was still yellow, still preserved. And from that era, our ideas and thinking around race and segregation were still so rife. I think about the Boer War rations from Steve 1989 MRE Info, where literally that was at the time that the Boers and the British were fighting, but also they were doing horrible, atrocious things to Africans during that time. He also opened this, I believe it was a British ration, Steve 1989, from like 1906. And I think that was meant to go to the soldiers in South Africa, but I also think about like Lord Kitchener at the time. And again, some of the horrible attitudes they had towards Southern Africans, the horrible atrocities that occurred. And honestly, it started taking me back into that thinking where I was like, this was just yesterday. Like so little has changed with cans. Like they had the common sense to abbreviate the net weight. They had the common sense to include instructions on the can. The font wasn't even that different. But their attitudes on race were terrible. And that made me realize, I mean, even Steve could eat some of the rations from this time. Like that's how well preserved it was. And I was like, man, racism just happened. Like our racial, racist, regressive attitudes were just yesterday. And in fact, Adolph Reed in his book, The South, talks about how, I mean, the era of Jim Crow, if you're thinking about the 20th century, that was 2/3 of the 20th century. And I was starting to think like, maybe I'm wrong about a lot of these things that these opinions that I have on like, oh, we shouldn't, you know, whatever, race essentialism or even anti-racism. But then I realized something, and it kind of flipped this sort of grievance outlook I was creeping into, where I was like, man, like, racism was just yesterday. I mean, racism was just yesterday. But we've made so much progress in such a short amount of time. And if you think about, like, going from the jazz singer, like I said, or the ideas around race, the stereotypes around race, the caricatures, like the blackface, like, again, yes, they had the common sense to make cans and to create preservation methods that were kind of still what we use today, but their ideas on race were so backwards, but so much changed so fast. And what was that due to? What was that rapid progression in racial thinking and equality due to? It was due to that second wave anti-racism that was built on harmony and not division. The type of second wave anti-racism, the likes of Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. That's what really ramped up and really flipped a lot of the attitudes we had towards race. The kind of thinking and attitude of Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I really want to emphasize that just because it was an older form of anti-racism, we need to realize that it did accelerate progress at a very rapid pace for mentalities and attitudes that probably were preserved for many more years than it took to dismantle. So I say all that to say, not all things that might have been before are bad. And again, bringing it back to Steve 1989 and New England Wildlife and More, there was this particular video that really struck me from Steve 1989, where he had a can like this, another can of cigarettes. Now, I don't smoke, and I'm not condoning smoking. I think it's really bad. But he opened up this can of cigarettes from 1906. And my initial reaction was going to be, these are terrible. I'm sure the earlier iterations of cigarettes were probably absolutely disgusting. They were still figuring it out. But Steve was like, you know what? This is the best cigarette I have ever had. He went on to describe certain fruity tones and chocolatey tones and earthy tones in these 1906 cigarettes that I was not expecting at all. 1906 cigarettes. And it made me realize something when it comes to the approaches of anti-racism we have today. Just because it was an older version of anti-racism doesn't necessarily make it worse. I'm sure there are things where we can talk further and dive deeper and things that people from back in the day might have not yet encountered. But again, just because we have a new version of anti-racism does not necessarily make it the better version of anti-racism. I know this was a very random, seemingly unrelated rant about cans or just discussion. I don't think it was a rant about cans and racism, but just a few things to think about. Some things I'll definitely think about every time I see a can, or I see a seal, or I see a can opener at work. Just remember the rapid progress of second wave anti-racism. Love you guys. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll catch you soon with a new something someday. Bye-bye.